Hey everybody, this is Pete A. Turner from Lyons Productions and the host of the Break It Down show. Hey, today's guest is a guy named Richard Lyons. He's a poet, he's a Midwesterner, he's an author. He wrote a great book called The DNA of Democracy. Look, I'm going to keep this short because I'm about to head up in the mountains and take a little break. But I want you guys to listen to this show because it's just a fantastic breakdown of what democracy is and how we got to the place where we're at now in our country. Not really a lot of politics, just a lot of understanding the system that we have in place. When we talk about politics, we go get experts. Today's expert is Dr. Wilfred Riley from Kentucky State University, and Dr. Will and Richard have a great conversation that I try to just pop in every now and then, crack a couple of jokes and get out of the way. This is a really neat thing to hear. I think you're going to enjoy it. Let me know what you think. Hit me up at Pete A. Turner on all social media. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Like John says every time, hey, we do this. This is how you support us. Share it. Like it. Subscribe to it. Get your friends to do it. Get other people to do it. This really helps us out. We always have shirts available on the website. That also helps us out. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've got a great guest. We want to hear from you guys. We want to participate with what you're doing in your life and illustrate for you the things that you can't get otherwise. So come and talk to us. Join us. And we thank you, as always, for listening to The Break It Down Show. Now here's Richard.
Lyons Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Okay, hello, this is Richard Lyons. This is the Break It Down show with Will and Pete, and I'm happy to start it off.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, this is great. I have Dr. Will with us because, we like to have people that know about, well, in this case, political science and democracy come on to help us understand better what Richard's written in his book. It's called DNA of Democracy. And I love your book, man. When I read it, and we talked about this pre-show, it's sort of in the style of Richard Green, who wrote the 48 Laws of Power. And his episode actually hasn't even posted yet, so we had him on. Richard he looked at power in different forms and established laws and said, here's how you broke it in history, here's how it worked in history, and here's the results from these historical moments. You've done something similar with sort of sussing out what the DNA of democracy is and how did we get things. And I love thinking about like Draco and the Magna Carta and these big moments in how we got to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and, the Bill of Rights and all these things. So what was your inspiration for this book, Richard? And maybe give us an idea of the path. Does it take you like 25 years to get us together?
Yes. Well, the first thing was, I'm a student of history and art and philosophy and that sort of thing. And I noticed, how rare democracy has occurred throughout history, and it's a very long history. But its brilliance when it is really espoused itself in full glory, as it did in Athens. It's just remarkable the amount of explosive energy that occurs. But it's brief, it's short-lived, and so I think I wrote the book because there's a common feeling in this country that our form of democracy is eternal. That because we've always had it, because we were born with it, there's no threat to it. And that's the opposite of true. So I thought if I wrote a work that was descriptive of what creates democracy, what the underpinnings of democracy are, and the contrary, what are the signs of tyranny? How do you know a tyranny is existing? How do you know it's threatening? And so I thought if I made that very clear in the upbringing of democracy, I thought it would be of benefit to the citizenry of a democracy, any democracy, really.
Interesting. One question I have a bunch of questions, but at the most basic level, I guess, this is something that we discuss a fair amount in political science. How would you define a democracy? What's a democratic state to you as versus a republic or any of the kind of mixed governments that we have? What is the magic juice to you that makes a society a democracy?
Well, our democracy is a mixed form of democracy based on all the democracies and republics that went before it. Now, they're remarkably few. But the democracy, the full democracy that existed in Athens is the form of democracy we have locally, best exemplified by the town halls in Massachusetts, from their beginnings to today, where the entire town shows up and say you have vote on whether you want a certain company to come in and occupy land in your town, and there's certain tax breaks, whatever you're trying to do. But that is something that's affecting every individual, and every individual should have a vote. Now, when we get to the above the town level to the county level, representation of an individual is less. When we get to the state, it's more a representative government that we have, a real republic. And when we get to the federal level, it's more like the federation that was witnessed in the Iroquois Confederation when the settlers landed in this continent. So we have different levels of different kinds of democracy and representative government.
Hey, this is Pete. Real quick, I just want to let you guys know we are proud to announce our official support of Save the Brave, a certified nonprofit 501c3 with a charter of helping veterans with post-traumatic stress. Here's how you can help. Go to savethebrave.com, click on the link on the website, and my recommendation is this. Subscribe. Give them $20 a month. You've got subscriptions that you can turn off right now that you're not using that are $20 a month. Swap that out. Get involved. Let's help these folks out.
So we have different levels of different kinds of democracy and representative government.
Yeah, direct democracy obviously doesn't work that well if you have 350 million people.
Yeah,
you could conceive
it's non-functional
or something, but I mean that's very limited in potential.
Yes, well, you're one of 350 million. So how much do you matter, and how much voice do you have? So yeah, that's the level that's remote. And in the original conception of the country, when they were founding the Constitution was built so that at the town level, everybody would have their own town, and it would be irrespective of what was going on at the federal level. It was the dominant government, the one you were affected by most, the one you affected most. Now it's turned upside down, where our federal government and the executive branch has massive power.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask is as you examine our own DNA of our own history, because we do have a mix. Like you could also say we have a dash of oligarchy in there and a spritz of this and these other things that kind of make this crazy soup that is something other than a straight democracy. When you look at our own DNA, what is in there that's surprising to you?
How uniquely America was founded. And that was the opposite of its forebear in Europe. When the settlers arrived here, they ran into a people that were already here, living here, the Amerindians, Native Americans, who had a very different conception of governance. Their conception was of the individual and how many rights the individual had, as opposed to what rights an aristocrat would have. And so that was very much infused into the mentality of America. And I don't know why we don't take more pride in the Native American heritage of this country, because it's pretty extreme. But again, it's in the DNA. It's not pronounced. It's not on the face of things anymore.
Yeah, I agree with you about the Native contributions to American democracy. That is something that's been minimized for a variety of reasons.
I'm not sure why. It's something to be very proud of.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it helps either sort of the grievance complaints that you sometimes see on the left or the jingoistic patriotism that you sometimes see on the right to say, well, these weren't organic ideas to some extent. We stole many of them from the Iroquois, if that's the correct word. So they weren't
stolen. They were given us.
Well, yeah, I don't think knowledge can be stolen. Actually, this gets into the idea of cultural appropriation and so on. I mean, virtually everything that we do has been learned from someone other than our ancestral group.
I don't know how else you learn.
Trade and all that.
Yeah.
One question that I do have, though, moving from kind of baseline ones to points that are a bit more detailed. When I read through your book, I enjoyed it. And one of the things you say a couple of times is that the DNA code for tyranny, this is a quote, is the concentration of power or the centralization of power. And I mean, you think of pharaohs when you hear that line, or, the autocrators in Byzantium. So are we in America today moving toward tyranny? I mean, if you read The Imperial Presidency and similar books, I'd say the consensus view in political science is that power is moving away from the states toward the fisc, the central government, at a dramatic rate. Presidents are becoming much more powerful, usurping things like the war-making power. Most of them now serve 8 years. Are we moving away from kind of that regional town meeting democracy toward a centralized imperial capital in Washington? What do you think? I've heard both sides of that. It's a fascinating conversation.
I think it's a normal graduation that any power has. And I go into this. This is volume 1 of a 3-part series. And so volume 2 will be concentrated where this book ends in 1963 and going from there. And my feeling is that any powerful entity does 3 things. It assumes power, then it protects its power, then it gathers more power, then it protects what it's gathered. Any power center, any single one. So that you're always going, and that was the beauty of the Constitution. You always have a balance between the power of the House of Representatives compared to the states, compared to the towns, compared to the individual. And I think in the past half century, there's been a gathering of power from the individual, from the town, from the county, the state, to the federal government. And within the federal government, there has been a shift of power from the House of Representatives, which is the foundation of our representative government, away from there to agencies, which are all governed by the executive branch. So our powers are being removed from us, and the most numerous amount of laws come out of agencies nowadays. And who talks to agencies nowadays? It's not me. I don't have an appointment with anybody in any agency today. You know who has an appointment? Lobbyists.
Right.
Every single day, lobbyists visit agencies. And all these people are in the same city. They're not in Wyoming. They're not in Louisiana. They're in Washington. So this is I think the idea of governance in America has been a bit turned upside down. Where we used to be governed mostly in our town by ourselves, we're now governed by one town. So yeah, I'd say there's a concentration.
So what's the end result of that? I mean, there are people that argue that large diverse societies inevitably slide toward empire. Regulating the clashes among very different groups of people in large numbers is something arguably that one king can do better than a series of local councils. I mean, you see that with...
That's a wonderful argument for tyranny.
Well, no, I'm not a fan of tyranny.
Rather than being governed by a king, we ought to just be governed by a law that gives everybody an equal right.
How do we prevent? I guess the question would be, and I agree with you. I mean, obviously, tyranny is not the goal. But if you look at the Roman Republic, later years, Byzantium, I mean, this happens all the time. So in America, how do we combat the centralization of power in D.C., where you look at K Street, for example, and you have literally every union or corporate lobbying arm within, what is that, a 1 mile area? How do you stop that and devolve a bit of the power back to the people? Or is that impossible?
Well, again, I'm going to go into that in volume 2 rather radically. I think K Street ought to be reassumed by the people through eminent domain. I think every building on K Street ought to be leveled and it made a public arena for people to speak. That
is a drastic solution, although, I mean, it would probably...
Well, how else do it? I don't... They're so entrenched now.
And then they'd start up the J Street.
Yeah, what about J Street?
Not all of J Street. You're like...
there are a bunch... I mean, even here in a small Frankfurt, which is the Kentucky state capital, I mean, we have a street that's literally called Capitol Avenue, which has 80 or 90 lobbying organizations on it, from the farmers to the Kentucky Association of...
I'll be darned.
Mansions, Kentucky Education Association. So, I mean, J Street is simply one of many agencies working through K Street. And you're probably right. It would take something along the lines of a nuclear bomb to truly remove that influence. The question is, are we...
I was thinking on the level of a tank division.
Okay. You probably do that.
One of the things that seems like, in terms of modern day, and we'll jump in when I get this stuff wrong, is that we're often sold this idea of voting. You have to vote, you have to vote, you have to vote. And of course, voting is an important exercising of your rights, but it also undervalues your rights. You're now picking from a menu that someone else decided for you. We kind of want a full serve government where we don't have to participate too much, but we do want to have power. And it's like, at some point, you've got to do something uncomfortable. You got to go sit on a committee. You have to go gather votes for somebody or something, some kind of participation level above simple voting. Voting to me seems like a byproduct. Like, are we going to pay for this school measure or not? Yes or no? Especially like when you look at our candidates for president, oh my goodness, there's so many people where I'm like, what is it? So I started asking my friends, what are presidential attributes? And they could tell me a lot of things that they weren't, but they struggled to describe what a presidential resume was.
That's a great point, Pete.
Well,
Great
isn't
point.
some of that because of how intensely politically correct we've become as a society? I mean, many of the things that are obvious political attributes like G-factor IQ and military service, you're almost not supposed to discuss. So, I mean, I think the profile for a president, I mean, G-factor IQ over 140, extensive military or bureaucratic experience. I mean, I don't think it would be incredibly hard to put together a description of who would be the ideal president. And it would be kind of entertaining to compare that to Mr. Trump or Mr. Obama or most of the presidents we've had recently. But I certainly think that's something feasible.
Yeah, I think, you know, everybody has their gifts, and the gift of an actor is not the same as the gift of a governor. The gift of an artist is not the same as the gift of a general. It's more aligned to, this is such a vast country to govern. It would take a certain characteristics to make it successful.
I think one point that's very interesting there, when you mentioned the gifts of an actor are not equivalent to those of a general or a legislator, one thing that I think the gifts of an actor would be very useful in service of is getting elected, however. So, yeah. I mean, in the television era, you definitely notice that we've moved toward tall, good-looking people who have very charismatic stage presence. I mean, you've had Reagan, you've had Trump, you've had Bill Clinton. And I mean, obviously the question is, do these people do as good a job as the dull, unattractive Lincolns and Coolidges and so on that we used to have? And I'd say the answer to that is empirically no. But again, that's
exactly. Few people saw Lincoln when he got elected. You know.
Well, that's right. I mean, if the Lincoln-Douglas debates were two ugly men arguing for 6 hours. I mean, some of the most brilliant guys in history. But the question is, obviously that would not be marketable today. I don't think Abraham Lincoln would make it out of the first round of the Republican primaries. So, I mean,
he'd have died in the primary. Yeah, but what they read, you know, what's interesting, Will, what they read was the text of the debates in newspapers, and so it was the words, not the image, that created the popularity.
Quite right, and this is my last point here. But I mean, I think this gets into the idea of how much detail can get to every citizen and be analyzed in depth by that citizen. So, I mean, democracy at the Athenian level, you're talking about city-states of perhaps 50,000 free men.
Right.
There's no mass media, a great deal of time on your hands. Reading or observing speeches is a form of entertainment. So you're getting this massive, in-depth, thick content from the candidates. Whereas today, I mean, if you look at, say, Trump and AOC going back and forth on Twitter over the past couple of days, you're seeing these quick, stylish, gestural statements, and that's what people see. So people today are more picking the heuristic they like than really going in depth and understanding what these people are saying. I mean, like, what's AOC's position on lowering top marginal interest rates or something? Nobody knows. The idea is that she's stylish, she's Latinx, quote unquote. So that's the heuristic you identify with.
Yeah. I thought she had a boyfriend, though. No?
Oh, Latinx, that was a joke. Latinx comes from the idea that the Spanish language is sexist. This is a real thing. So in Spanish, no soy fluente, pero se habla español bastante bueno por americano. I use it sometimes in security consulting. But Spanish, of course, all the words end in O or A. So the feminists started attacking this, saying you should end every word with an X so that it doesn't potentially offend anyone. So AOC will refer to herself as Latinx.
Well, I don't think that's going to go phonetically. I mean, every word ends in X. This will be difficult. It'll turn German.
Going back to the original Aztec. I mean, a beautiful language.
Now, I married a girl from Italy, and her language is very expressive and very beautiful. I think if you put an X at the end of every word, it'll just make it brutal.
Yeah, especially because Italian focuses on vowels. Right. You know, as opposed to other languages that don't. And then so you start putting a big old nasty X at the end of things, it becomes a problem. But that stuff really is sort of secondary. So I want to go back into the book a little bit. And I love how you went back into history, you know, just looking at how these things evolved, you know, and like the Magna Carta is a great example, you know, as like we sign this thing, the king is sort of forced to comply. And then, you know, subsequent kings kind of like, nah, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
And then ultimately they don't. And then, you know, Thomas More gets killed. I'm a big Thomas More fan. But all of these things progress in a way. But then at some point, the progression is stopped. It is decided. Magna Carta does hold. Now, what are we writing now? What's our thing to keep power with the people?
I'm not sure what we're writing now, other than apologist statements for greater government. And this, again, it'll be in volume 2. You can tell the amount of power or size of anything by how much it eats and how much waste material there is. And just by that alone, the government we have is massive. But all the apologists are on the side of greater government. They find a wound in some populace in the country, and we have to create a new agency. Then we have to fund it. Then we have to make sure nobody can be fired from it. It just goes on and on. So I don't know of anybody writing. I mean, there's the Cato Institute, there's the Federalist Society, these sorts of persons, but it's almost you're trying to kill a Tyrannosaurus Rex with a BB gun with the sort of things that are written.
So, I mean, there are a couple of interesting questions here. One that's crossed my mind when I read through really almost the introduction for the book, this is one of the first things you said, is that democracies often perish through what are then thought to be kindnesses, which I thought was a good phrase. And you can sort of see that risk. I mean, instead of one cold Persian or Roman emperor with a genius level IQ and a coterie of advisors, democratic government at some level is just everybody voting. So, I mean, what are some kindnesses that you think could put our society at risk today? What's your take on the modern social justice or open borders movements, for example? Are we going to kill ourselves with kindness?
Let's see. How do I address that? I thought in those terms of all the benefits that are derivable now from government. And I think it's a statistic that it's 20% of the population now gets direct benefits from the government, and something near half get indirect benefits from the government. Now, that is a lot of kindness, but it's also a lot of control. Anything given to a person, in a sense, controls them. You're controlling two things: the person you're taking the money from and the person you're giving the money to. And the minute you'll know how much control you exercise is when you try and take the money back. So if I say to a person who's gaining benefits today, I'm going to take that $100 from you this week and every week thereafter. And what they think of that benefit as being is a life benefit. And the minute you try and take it, you control them. You control how they vote. Equally so on the other end of the equation, those persons whom you tax, they will be affected by if you say, I'm going to reduce your taxation by $100 a week. You control that person's vote doing so. So it's an enormous amount of power just on the level of $100. And so I always wonder, we have a little dog. I think he's a wonderful guy. And he's always, attended on the leash. But I wonder, whether he would take the leash if I took away the food. I can keep him on a leash and collar because he wants to eat.
Yeah. When we look at doing kindnesses, for example, taking care of socioeconomic strata that are below survivability. Yeah. This is what Charles Murray talks about, Murray's Law. You can design a system and you're inevitably going to miss the people that you wanted to help and ultimately cause more harm. And I've seen this in combat zones. I would go out and watch the execution of government that we designed and was supposed to be, even better and create stability. And I'll be damned if we weren't the most instability creating machine.
Holy cow.
Just by our mere presence. And then we start monkeying with things and inevitably got worse.
This idea of kindnesses causing problems is a really interesting one because the government expands through almost the rejection of trade-offs in favor of proposed solutions. So, for example, we'll see something like a baby is tossed across an airplane. This happened in the 1980s by wind turbulence or something.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, there are these massive safety regulations on the airline industry coming from the government. A separate seat needs to be purchased for children. Children need to be buckled in or restrained. Even pets need to fly below in the cargo deck. All of a sudden, the government has taken control of, say, 1% of the airline industry. And the question that I often have is whether this produces any positive outcomes whatsoever. If the cost of air travel has roughly doubled, for example, for members of young families, how many of them choose to drive cross country and put themselves at a much greater risk of actually being injured? So what you often see in these situations is that nothing changes. I mean, we've all had blue collar jobs. I mean, the rates of injury on a construction job site have been the same for 60, 70 years, really. Nothing changes except the mass of regulation, the giant OSHA manual, hanging from the trailer in the job site that no one reads. But the government, as a result of this, has consolidated more power, has expanded further. So, I mean, I guess the question from an interview perspective is, how should governments handle the urge to be kind? Is there a limit to who we should help? I mean, what do you guys think? Because this is a tough one. This is one of the things that's being used to really attack both Trump and the centrist Democrats. Now, they're children in cages, and nobody wants children in cages. But the question is, do you then put the children in adult detention facilities? Do you release any illegal immigrant who shows up with a child into the country? So in reality, these are often very tough, hard questions, but the urge to do good allows governmental expansion, so no one wants to be seen opposing it. When should we oppose it?
Well, what I've noticed is there's always discussion of how government should expand, and there is never, not one discussion of how it should contract and how we should decrease the size of the federal government. There is never a discussion of that. If there is, I haven't heard it. That, I think, is the problem. And you've got a media that literally searches down that child. Hey, let's not talk about being thrown across an airplane. Just any child who, didn't have breakfast and says, "Oh my God," and they put the child on the television internationally on CNN and say, "Oh my God, look at how inhumane America is. This child missed its breakfast. We need an entire sweeping new agency to make sure she doesn't." It's overkill. The media really uses it.
That's actually an excellent point that you just made, that government programs don't go away because although we all know that they're bloated and inefficient, they're also seen as the sole providers of necessary kindnesses. I hadn't really thought of it that way. But yeah, that's...
Well, and here's another thing to think about. Prior to the Great Society, and if you go back in history, charity was always devolved from the spiritual agencies in society, not the government agencies. Why? Because the basic intent of a spiritual agency is to get the dependent well and independent. The will of a government agency is to keep you dependent and to grow, right? So it's a very different incentive. The two incentives are opposite.
It's a great point, because if you really were serious about immigration in terms of the immediate ground truth immigration on the ground, controlling access to the thing, a wall. I mean, you can't have someone everywhere. And what's harder? Is it harder to help someone who's crossing the desert and away from a port of entry? Or is it easier to funnel them towards a port where you can then have resources and everything else? You can't just run across 50 miles east of Yuma and say, "I want asylum." Like, this is the place. We can't get the people that want asylum to go to the asylum spot. So now we've created this well of horrible humanity by not being able to manage something.
Well, my question is, where's the Red Cross?
Yeah.
Where's the Catholic Church of Mexico? Why aren't there people from these societies on that border taking care of all these people while the civil governing authority takes care of, organizing this thing? There's more powers in society than just a federal government. But the problem is all complaints and all powers are resting in one place now. There's one media and one government, and it's all federal.
And I was going to say, add this on there, like in California back in the 80s, we wanted to approve the lotto because it was going to give all kinds of money to our schools. And then the legislators appropriately said, now that that's handled, let's use this other money that we earmarked for schools and push it towards somewhere else. And then, because you can, as a government, you can always run on improving education. You can always run on rights for the people that need rights the most. You can always run on that and ask for money and get money on that. It's an ever-increasing power suck that...
Yes.
Ugh.
And it all went back to the first, and it was a great notion by FDR. Let's create a social security system that everybody invests in, everybody puts their money in. Well, the first thing the government did was spend it. Then they gave everybody an IOU and said, if you don't vote our way, we're not going to pay you back. I mean, what a great way to get a vote. And it's the same thing again and again.
Another thing that's interesting here, and this is backtracking a little bit, there seem to almost be two debates going on when it comes to a lot of these issues. There's kind of the moral debate about whether a solution is kind or cruel, and that often eclipses the logical debate about whether the solution would work. So, I mean, when Pete said that one of the best solutions to immigration would be to build a wall across the border, that does seem kind of cold and heartless. But at the same time, we've seen this work in Israel. We've seen this work in Egypt. There's a fortified wall on Mexico's southern border, for example. So in reality, most people probably acknowledge that if you put up a big ass concrete and tool steel wall, fewer people would be able to cross into the USA. The debate is shifted away from that by advocates of larger government and by advocates of immigration reform by the comment that the wall is a morally bad thing, whether or not this would work. And we see this all the time with things that range from busing to affirmative action, expansion of welfare programs. The idea isn't, will these actually make life better? The idea is more, are they good things that we ought to do? So, I mean, that seems a problematic road for the government to go down. And again, I mean, this is a strong argument, as you said, for private charity, for people that have a limited amount of enterprise resources dealing with these problems because they might have to actually try to solve them. So that's kind of a side note, but I find that interesting that there are really two conversations. One is about, is this good? And the other is about, would this work? And I think we need to focus more on, would this work? If it turns out that affirmative action is a morally good idea, but what you're doing is mismatching tens of thousands of students with colleges, all you're doing is hurting a bunch of people. So again, something to consider in a policymaking role, I suppose.
Well, again, my point is that all problems are given to one place, and all solutions, they think, derive from one place. The original setup of our society was that there were multiple diverse centers of power, not one. And that was the gift of this country, was that there were a lot of people had solutions and the solutions worked, right? If they didn't work, another power center would come up with a solution. In our federal government, it was supposed to be between branches, many people with many voices. But that too has been strained away to agencies and lobbyists.
I want to ask you about that, about the setup of our government having three parts. I think it's fair to say that at some point, the Supreme Court system, all court systems are overwhelmed, right? And so if they can hear, I don't know what the number is, let's say it's 100 cases a year, they're going to pick and choose the things that they want to vote on and everything else. And so a lot of voices are silenced out because we haven't figured out how to handle the load for the courts. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not as versed in the judiciary. You've got so many things going on at once that were normally handled at the state judiciary level. Every state had its own laws. But now so many laws pertain to the federal system, it is being overwhelmed. Do you agree with that, Will?
Yeah, I would say, I think that there are, yes, in general, the concentration of power at the federal level has a lot of problems. The Supreme Court, very definitely, I mean, they hear about 100 cases a term. And the attempted caseload, I mean, the number of cases coming up from the appellate court seeking cert has increased dramatically over the past couple of decades. So, yeah, to some extent, the Supreme Court, they're actually not swamped. They're hearing the same number of cases. I mean, being an upper-level governmental bureaucrat often means you don't necessarily have to work brutally hard, although I'm sure they put in long hours in the library. But the number of matters that they're asked to hear that go unresolved if they don't hear them has dramatically increased. One point that I would refer to again that you made earlier is that remarkably, most law is no longer made by Congress. It's certainly no longer made by state legislatures, but this is something that most people do not know. Obviously, the president can go before Congress and seek the creation of an executive agency or an executive regulatory agency. And these agencies have the power to make regulation that has essentially the force of law. And over the past couple of decades, the actual role of these agencies, for example, the EPA has quadrupled or quintupled in terms of the amount of regulation that's out there, the FDA, OSHA, so on. The problem with all of this is that these are entrenched Ming emperor-style bureaucrats. They are never elected by anybody. They hold office across multiple presidential administrations, so that's part of the issue. The massive amount of judge-made law because of the massive amount of federal statutory legislation is another issue. I think more troublingly than the Supreme Court being workload swamped, one of the issues you have now is that district and appellate court judges who know they're not going to be reversed are making law. So you regularly see headlines like President's immigration plan or Democrats' budget proposal struck down by district court judge. Now, that probably will be reversed at the appellate level, but I mean, one of the guys I golf with is a district court judge. That's just the guy who oversees County X at the federal level. So, I mean, it is very problematic that instead of an elected agency, that guy gets to review something like a national immigration proposal. And that proposal itself may well have been written by an unelected agency of some kind. So Congress, to some extent, out of laziness, for want of a better word, has given a great deal of its lawmaking function to the president. The president will come before Congress and say, we need an agency to regulate X, Department of Homeland Security, for example, non-military international conflicts. That power will be given. And from that point forward, that agency is going to have as much of a role there as Congress does. So all of this is problematic, yes.
And there's another effect to that, Will, if I may, and that is that so much rides on the election of a president now. If you go back to the 50s, I don't think many Democrats were bothered by the fact that Eisenhower was the president. But because that position is so powerful now, it is, everybody has a passion about it in the country because so much depends on it. It used to be that how you lived, what you depended on was, the disposition of your state. You never had much interaction with the federal government. Now it's everywhere. And so we treat presidential politics as life and death. And that is the opposite of the way the system was set up. And I think it's another effect of what's going on today. And I think it's a bad effect.
I would agree. I mean, the Congress has dealt with an Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason. I mean, that was supposed to be the people's house, the most powerful branch, clearly. And the reason presidential politics is so critical today, or is perceived as so critical, is a direct result of what we've been describing. It is the president who appoints judges. It is the president who appoints the leadership of these executive agencies, executive regulatory agencies, executive administrative agencies. So when a new president comes in, it's no longer just the president. You know that president is going to appoint, what's the average, 3,400 very partisan judges. You know that president is going to appoint the top 7,000 people in the executive bureaucracy. And that's how policy changes. It's not so much that the president works with Congress to pass laws. I mean, most of the past presidents and Congresses have barely been functional together. If you look at Trump, Obama, it's that the agency law that comes out of D.C. will change. And this can be very massive. I mean, for example, does the U.S. give any aid to medical services that provide abortion globally, potentially saving 1 million lives? All that now is tied to the president only, which is, I think we're all saying this over and over, a problem.
Yeah.
So what to do is the question. I mean, but yeah, you're definitely seeing that centralization in D.C. and around the quote-unquote imperial president. That's not really deniable.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lyons Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Yeah, you're definitely seeing that centralization in D.C. and around the quote-unquote imperial president. That's not really deniable.
Let me ask you this, too. In terms of your book, The DNA of Democracy, each segment you have a pyramid, and you slowly expand down the pyramid, the different elements of the power that goes into, whether it's the church or spies or lords and that kind of thing. Are we filling in new blanks with our government and the way it works now? Because hearing Will describe this, it's maddening to realize that's right. There's 3,000 judges. These people are passing law that unless it gets elevated to a Supreme Court that only takes 100 cases, it's going to remain law. Oh, and by the way, we have people in jail, based on DNA evidence that it's not them, but they can't get out because it can drive you crazy. Is crazy our new block?
There's a real problem also with, where are the laws coming from? It's not from the people's representatives, right? And it's at the federal, state, not the local. It's not local. It's not state. It's federal. And the masses of laws coming out of there. And then the laws that did come out of the legislature, right? Okay, so let's take immigration as our example. The laws of immigration came out of the people's representative house. But if you don't enforce those laws, the negative of the law is the law, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't enforce the law against an alien being in the country, you're giving them citizenship. It's the negative of the law, de facto.
Pretty much.
Right? If you don't enforce the law against murder, murder becomes a right. That's the way the system works. So you're not only creating laws nobody has any representation in, You're also not enforcing laws that the people agreed on. It's a huge problem when pointed out in that manner. And so this is where volume 2 goes after volume 1. And I'll be happy to look you up, Will, as reference.
Sure, yeah. I'd love to read the book. I'm glad to provide a scholarly review, some comments. I mean, I review probably 15 or 20 books a year, I'd say. And I mean, my ideas seem to be generally not considered totally idiotic. I mean, I've edited a couple. So yeah, I'd be glad to see volume 2.
Great. Wonderful.
One question I do have that's a bit more broad than just the construction points in our democracy. Before the book even opens on page XIV, you mentioned sort of this idea of the Jerusalem-Athens combination in the West that's been discussed by thinkers from Thomas Jefferson to really Ben Shapiro and Tim Weiss. Do you believe that sort of reason and revelation are both necessary for a successful democracy? What to you needs to exist among the citizenry for a democracy to function in terms of that question about why there have been so few? What is needed for people to be free men and women?
I think that the common aspect between what occurred in Israel and what occurred in Athens was that rather than having the Pharaoh as one person assumed to be that was above the law, right, and so exercised a tyrannical office, Moses might have done the same, but instead they raised 10 laws as being above all persons, right? It's the idea that's above the tyrant. And Athens did the same thing when it got rid of Isagoras. They decided all persons, creating laws over all persons of equal rights, an idea that was above the tyrant, that no man could be above. That's the difference. It's not a matter of the difference between revelation and reason. It's the idea of law being above all persons and all persons having recourse in the law, equal recourse. When you stray from that, that becomes a problem.
So when Louis says, I am the state, he's saying no to you on that. And when he's killing his friends,
right,
who not even actually usurp his power, but, you know, in some way offend him or whatever, this becomes a problem. And that power was Socrates or Plato that said power corrupts all or whatever. And that's when we get into the spot where the state just gets out of control.
I think it was Diogenes, but
yeah, one of them
I think it's true.
Dead Greek guys, right?
But if you want to see the reality of what I'm talking about, it's best revealed in the section on the American Revolution, where we were a free people with our own charters, our own laws, and then the king, within a 10-year span, wanted to change all that and exercise a tyranny. And it's why we are created as we are. So I'd recommend that part of the read on that. It was one man trying to say, wait a minute, you don't have any laws. The law, you know, I am the law. and that was the whole cause of the revolution.
That's actually a very interesting definition of a tyrant, someone who can legally break the law, someone who is formally above the law. So, I mean, that I would agree that that's one of the preconditions for democracy, that there be no tyrants in the technical sense, that no one be above the law. There's some quirky elements of that, even with the presidency today, when people are talking about Mr. Obama or Mr. Trump. Could they be charged with a crime or even sued in office? But in general, we seem to be fairly tyrant-free. But are there any other cutoffs you think need to exist for a democracy, a certain number of middle-class yeomen or any of the things people say?
I'm not sure what you refer to there, Will.
There's some discussion.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, there's some discussion in political science about what characteristics are needed for a democracy to exist successfully. So the conservative writer Ben Shapiro has said that he thinks you need both reason and revelation. You need a moral, preferably Judeo-Christian base, and you need some sort of scientific methodology among the citizens. And I would disagree with that. I don't think that there's any Judeo-Christian tradition, obviously, in ancient Athens or modern Japan or anything like that. But I mean, so that's an argument that's been made. You, I think, very effectively stated you need to have a legal system that encompasses everyone and people need to follow that. But I mean, there's also a lot of empirical research on this. So in poli-sci, we find that almost no society with an average purchasing power parity of GDP of under $10,000 per person is a democracy. And almost every society above that level is a democracy. So do you need a certain number of educated, armed people with money to be a democracy, bluntly? Do you need a certain lack of decadence to be a democracy? Are there any cutoffs that you think would render democracy impossible in a nation state?
Nation governed by law tends to be more prosperous nation that has a spiritual element to it tends to be more law-abiding. And I think any society like that has a tendency to defend itself against corruption, and so is better off.
Yeah, I think empirically, as a testable question, if you asked, are reasonably moral, prosperous societies more likely to be democracies, the answer would be empirically yes, to a statistically significant degree. The question really is which way that causation cuts. It's probably cyclical. I mean, probably both poles reinforce the other, if that makes sense. But interesting.
Yes, I think that's a point made in the book at a certain point, that democracy, the spirituality of the founders of the country lent to democracy and all persons being equal. Christ was, after all, the first person to be a liberator, in a sense, by respecting everybody. And secondarily, persons with that sort of spiritualism tend to create democracy, and democracy tends to support all faiths, not one. Right? Tends to respect all faiths, all beliefs, not one belief. Because once you have one belief, that's a problem.
Well, there's an inherent contradiction between the idea of one man, one vote, and the idea of the saved and the damned. So, I mean,
exactly.
Why would the damned get the same?
That's really well put. And that goes back to my episode with Isagoras. Yeah. He came out and loudly declared that half of Athens was cursed, the half that didn't like him. Now, what does that mean? It means that he sets himself up in power with himself and his friends. Yeah. And he took the lands of everybody who wasn't, and told them they were to be exiled from the political process and exiled from their home and their lands.
This is a cyclical problem for democracies. Like, in a democracy that has any kind of primary school system at all, everyone's been taught the idea of one man, one vote. Everyone's roughly morally equal. So it's very hard to say that other people should be disenfranchised. And the way this is done is to describe your political opponents as so evil they don't deserve human rights anymore. You see this now on the political left and alt-right, by the way, and you have since Marcuse's repressive tolerance, I would say. The idea, everyone gets to vote unless you're a Nazi, defined by me. So, I mean, this is an ongoing problem. I mean, if you look at a casual friend of mine, Andy Ngo, was recently beaten by a left-wing activist group. And there was a mass amount of defense of this in the media, with people saying, well, sure, you shouldn't beat people with crowbars, but look at what he was saying. So that's how you disenfranchise people in a democracy. You brand them as cursed or over the line or beyond the pale. They're literal terms for this.
Yeah, don't worry about it. He's just a Republican. Or don't worry about it. He's just a Democrat.
Had to die.
It's not a big deal. Yeah. We all got to live together. So there has to be a reason. There has to be a means. And the means is democracy.
So what do we do? I mean, you've studied this stuff. Let me just say this. Everybody should buy DNA of Democracy. It's written by Richard Lyons. You can go to his website to learn more about him. It's lylea.com, Lylea.com. Get the book on Amazon. And as always, when you go to Amazon, make sure you buy. And just spend an extra, literally 30 seconds and hit 5 stars and then rate the book and say, best book I've ever read, or whatever it is. He was great on the Break It Down show if you want to throw in a plug. Do that, and that gets his book elevated with the other books of its type, and that'll really help out Richard because, I mean, look what he's doing for us here. He's spending his time. He's giving us all this great insight, and it's frustrating, but it's a wonderful conversation because it's frustrating in a way that forces us to respond to our current problems. Because if we rely on TV to tell us what our problems are, they're going to change it every 20 minutes, and we'll never get anywhere with any of this. My question to you is, when we look at the root of what we're trying to deal with democracy, with our inability to regulate how big the government gets and everything else, if you were to go back even 50 years in time or whatever, and I put your hands on the control of our democracy, what lever are you going to slide or push to change an outcome that would maybe put us in a better spot today? Or is this just how democracies work? Dr. Leday and I, he's on the show a lot, we talk about, tolerance and bigotry, and a big part of democracy is tolerating the freedom that your neighbor gets, even if you don't like it.
Yeah, bigotry is a spiritual matter, and democracy is a matter of each citizen having a right. If I go back 50 years, Pete, what has changed most is that governance is no longer local. There used to be a big element that was local, and there used to be an element that was at the county level, at the state level. And that is less and less now. And there has been an equal shift at the federal government where all decisions are now being made away from the people's house and into private hands, right? Whether it's an agency head or whether it's a lobbyist. So I think that's the difficulty we face now. And if I were to say, where did the levers go wrong? It was a part of the House of Representatives abdicating their responsibilities and saying, well, let's just have an agency take care of that. Because agencies, again, they are like any living thing. You have to think of them as a living thing. They eat, they grow, they strengthen, and the more they strengthen, the more power they concentrate in themselves. And then they defend themselves, like any lion in the jungle does, right? This is my territory. It's where I go. It's where I hunt. And you're not allowed here. And the last thing you're going to do is kick me out. So you have to look at it in terms of nature, too. It's in the nature of things. And so when you speak about the nature or DNA of tyranny as opposed to the DNA of democracy, in a democracy, power is not concentrated. It's diffused. That's its strength. So the tendency of these agencies and lobbyists is to take away from that. And I think in the past 50 years, that's been the difficulty. And I'll get into it in volume 2. I hope to do a good job as to describing it.
Yeah, I'm excited for volume 2.
Good. Great.
So let's see. One thing you said that I thought was very interesting is that the ultimate question of how free a society is, really, I think whether it's a democracy or not, although democracies would tend to be the freest societies, is whether the individual determines their own success. To what extent in the modern USA, given the massive central government, programs like affirmative action and legacy programs on the other side of the quote-unquote racial fence, corporate cabals, to what extent do you think Americans wholly determine our own success in life? Do you have an estimate on that, or is that a valid question to consider? What do you think?
I think it's a valid question. I don't have an answer to that as to how, a percentage. But I think the more the government helps, the less well off the society is. That's not government's job. And it was never designed to be government's job to offer a hand up. That's the job of an association. If a university in its private interest wants to extend a scholarship, that's one thing. But for a central government to determine that the University of Utah ought to have certain numbers of students that the government dictates it should have, and this business of government funding educational institutions rather than states or associations that's very controlling. I'll just leave it at that. It's very controlling. And now for the government to decide who gets a loan in order to go to college, and that money, that pot of money, is what the government distributes to the educational system. Think about the control inherent in that idea. Yeah, that's a very controlling position for the government to have. And when it swept up all loans in the country into itself for a university, and now look what it's done. It's inflated the cost of every university education in the country. It's inflated the cost. And the amount of money is massive. And there you go again with a good kindness. You're trying to be kind.
Yeah.
You've buried a generation in debt.
It's a great point, though. Like when you look at the Department of Education, first off, we get mad at Betsy DeVos, but no one can name any of the other 11 secretaries prior to her or talk intelligently at all about what. And I'm not defending Betsy DeVos.
Well, think of the power that just went into the hands of that agency with this massive amount of money that now the government determines who gets schooled and who doesn't.
Yeah, no provable success for all that money. My buddy Todd said the other day, when they start paying off student loans for free, I want you guys to know that my home loan identifies as a student loan, because that shit is fucking funny.
Yeah, exactly. I took out a mortgage on my house to pay for the education because the costs are so inflated.
Yes.
It's just ridiculous.
Well,
just
you
ridiculous.
can use Pete's logic with virtually anything. My Smith & Wesson identifies as a pair of Birkenstocks. But I mean, banter aside, one thing that both of you gentlemen said in that conversation that I think is fascinating is that it's not the government's role to help. I would agree with that more than 70%. That's interesting because that's almost entirely what our government does, quote unquote, help. If you look at the government's budget and you include the full budget with all quote unquote entitlements programs in it, 70% or so of the U.S. government's budget is Social Security disability, Medicare, Medicaid. This is before you get into student loans. Affirmative action is hard to quantify in numerical terms, but over $100 billion in impact. I think everyone agrees. So what the government does to the tune of about $2 trillion a year is quote unquote help people. That's 2 or 3 times the defense budget that's constantly bleated about on one side of the political fence. So, I mean, as a serious question, would you guys cut all of that or almost all of it? How would you handle this help?
At my core, I'm a libertarian, right? And I try to decide, I'm trying to figure this out right now existentially or Pedro-stentially. There's a balance between the Stoic philosophy where you're working on your own internal ability to withstand the storm. And then they're like more like Gandhi that want to reach out and help and do things through the masses. And so there's a struggle there. And I think it's a DNA type struggle where you're aligned one way or the other. So I would want to cut entitlements. I'm fine cutting the military budget a little bit too. I think we're a little bit too fat there, but show me the congressional representative that wants to run on less high-tech, military jobs. Those guys don't exist.
I have a more general answer to that. Okay. And that is that the government of the United States has tried to take over the spiritual authority of the country and assume to itself all the offices of charity. Now, when you do that as a government, think of the control that represents.
Yeah.
And there again, it was not designed to be that way. When the architect of the Constitution was asked, well, should the government be assuming any roles of the church? He thought it was madness. The idea was utter madness. Because when you give that power to take from one and give to another, the power in the middle is just massive. It's determining people's fates. It's determining what's on their table. And these are very basic powers that should never be assumed by a government. So my answer is all this kindness ought to be offhanded from the federal government first to the states to determine if they, as states, want to cover the cost. And secondarily, offhanded from the states to private associations where it stood effectively in America until the Great Society. And we are the most generous nation on earth. And all the persons who need help would have help, but it wouldn't be at the government bludgeon.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to think about the government being someone that protects our bootstraps so we can bootstrap ourselves and then let ourselves help other people, as opposed to coming in behind you and me too in your way into a pair of shoes with the government. It just doesn't work. The power trade-off to give the government the ability to help everyone is at the expense of our own individual power. And then it just doesn't work after a while.
Very quickly, I think there's some place for government help, but we should almost perhaps reverse the system we have now, where charity should begin first in the family, then in the spiritual community, then in the city. Every town of more than 10,000 has a food pantry, a gym where people could sleep in the worst case, then the state, then the federal government. I'm not sure how you'd implement that, but I mean, I could see certain things like a voluntary Social Security investment program or long-term unemployment insurance being useful federal benefits. But in that kind of reverse pyramid, the goal would be that only those people that had been unable to be helped by any level below would be dependent on the government. One very quick follow to this also, do you guys have any thoughts on the Andy Yang universal basic income idea? What he says, I'm assuming it's going to be too hard nose, but what he says is actually logically true. He says that if you take the amount of money we currently spend on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security disability, and cash welfare, if you took that amount of money, which is 71% or whatever of the federal budget, and simply broke it down in cash dollar terms, you could write every American a check for $31,000 a year. So he advocates about half that. But what do you think of that? Instead of a massive centralized bureaucracy, we have a small office that sends out checks in a genuinely redistributionist fashion. The amount of money we spend on kindness today could give everyone $30,000 a year. Should we do it, or should we just give taxpayers their damn money back?
From my perspective, anybody who received free money to the tune of $31,000 would spend it within a month and then come back for more.
I thought we all decided that trickle-down economics didn't work. Is trickle up the new trickle down?
From a quantitative research standpoint, bubble up economics does work because poor people are terrible at saving.
Right.
Wait a minute, Will. Pete, just don't tax everybody $31,000. Let them keep it. Why does it have to go through the government at all?
But we love inefficiency.
Well, the thing with these bureaucracies is that whether you support genuine semi-socialism like UBI, or as I think all of us, you have a more libertarian approach. I think we all make enough money. You'd like to keep some of it. But I mean, the government right now is at a peak of maximum intentional inefficiency, I would say. In that we don't have national health care. We have 9 separate healthcare bureaucracies. Pete might help me with some of these as a military guy, but I mean, what do we have? We've got Medicare, Medicaid. The military's got like 4, TRICARE, VA. We've got Kid Care, iCobra. Every one of these has a bureaucratic staff of more than 100,000 people making more than $60,000 a year. So if you look at the cost of a lot of these programs, it's the cost of the bureaucracy. It's not actually the amount of money that's being sent to the final recipient that's billing us.
Yes.
People on welfare get $400 a month, but a welfare caseworker makes $60,000. You might correct me, but there's one for every 2 recipients in most states. So
now, hold on there, Will. Do you think that distributor of welfare would ever want to give up their job? Would they ever want one person on the rolls of welfare to go off the rolls of welfare?
Well, of course not.
They will never diminish their position. Their job grows by how many people are dependent, not the opposite.
I think we agree on that. No, I mean, I think that either a libertarian society or an Andy Yang society, however, would just fire the mid-level bureaucrat. Like, if you want to give people money, I go to the ATM for the bank every couple of days, takes 30 seconds. It's not that hard to write people a check. What we have are these massive, intensive bureaucracies that exist because they are voting blocks for one political party or the other. And my point is just that's the maximum level of inefficiency. If you've ever looked at, I mean, for example, I work in higher education. The number of bureaucrats we have on a typical college campus, never mind, of course, which is perfectly run since I'm involved with the running of it to some extent. But I mean, it's not just teachers. It's things like assistant Greek life coordinators. I mean, the number of people that are brought in to staff these bureaucracies is the primary cost of government. So, well, close to it. Just getting rid of the bureaucracies would be an enormous step forward, whether you give people their money back or you continue just writing checks.
I wonder, Will, if there's a parallel between the growth of all that bureaucracy in universities and the assumption of the federal government of all the monies that go to universities.
There definitely is. Universities lobby very, very effectively, from the heterodox academy types on the right over to the much more powerful American Association of University Professors. The answer is yes. I mean, I'm to some extent involved in academic politics. One of the things that surprised me the most about American upper middle class life coming from a working class background was the amount of bump, paperwork, nonsense, BS pursuit of this or that standard for your college. So, I mean, at K-State, we're fairly typical. We're actually fairly well run. So I'm not mocking our administration, but we have, I think, 117 professors and about 600 staff people. That's very typical. A lot of universities,
Wow.
A lot of universities double that. So I think it was Brown, 200 professors, 1,100 staff members. And so when you think about this money that's being spent on your child's college education, it's not necessarily being spent on, you know, the wonderful teacher of history with the white beard who's a military veteran who's written 6 books. It's being spent on the 74 volleyball coaches. So bureaucracy has a way of growing like Topsy. And I mean, to some extent, it has to be stopped.
It goes to fundamental law. If you're given money, you're going to spend it.
Yeah.
And if you're given a certain sum, you're going to take out a loan against it, and you're going to spend that. And if a certain entity has, take 100% intake of an elephant, how much of that is going to be waste? How much of is going to be left behind as waste? How much is going to be fat in his system? If you look at things in those terms, it simplifies a lot.
I would also say that the other thing universities have a propensity for doing is bragging about their endowments. We have the greatest endowment of all time. Well, then fucking spend some money, motherfuckers.
Yeah. Well, the minute you make it up to them to spend the money as themselves, their own institution, watch the bloat go away.
This actually, that again is one of a couple critical points that have come up in this conversation. I recently looked at university endowments. And I mean, for example, Harvard's is on the order of $40 billion. A surprising number of the Fortune 500 entities in the USA, if you move beyond corporations, are universities. My own University of Illinois in the Big Ten, which is elite but mid-level among the elite, is about $5 billion. So, I mean, could these universities, how many people go to Harvard in a typical year entering class? 2,000?
Yeah.
Could these universities pay for every one of their students to go for free and live in fully subsidized housing using the interest on their endowments?
Just with the interest.
How about this? I saw a story where like Jeff Bezos or one of those like ultra rich people cannot spend the money faster than they make it. And I'm not talking about the intake from Amazon. Like you cannot physically write checks fast enough to kick them out at the rate that they make money on interest and everything else, just because the pile is so big. So on $40 billion, how much do they make a minute in interest at just even 5%? And it's Harvard. You know they make more than 5%. And then they have their annual drive. They would be fine. They could self-fund at this point. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fair to say that they'd have about a $3.8 billion a year operating budget, just doing some calculations in my head. And I think they could scrape by on 3.8 bill. They might have to cut a few things, the Department of Post-Colonial Studies, but they could make it. So they're really, in a lot of these artificial economies, there's really a false debate. When you're talking about the cost of government, you're only about 50% talking about the cost of recipient funding. The rest is the cost of the massive middleman bureaucracies, which you can eliminate tomorrow. Same thing in the universities. I mean, if you just trimmed the universities back down to faculty, students, and a few varsity coaches, 70% of the budget's gone tomorrow. So these are artificial economies that have been allowed to grow up because of, and here we get back to point jump, government subsidy. Could you end them tomorrow? Yes. Will we? No.
Right. Imagine the outcry if you ever did any of this.
Yeah, and what large institution can continually and perpetually grow and just get fatter and fatter? That doesn't work in the private world. Actually, if we wanted to figure out medical care, you would just find some incentive for Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Tim Cook and go, hey, you 5 guys have 30 days to figure this out, or X happens. And if you figure it out, Y happens. And then, boom, we'll have a solution, because I'd rather pay a subscription and not have to have a job, not have to have all the other nonsense added onto it. Just figure out an answer, because I tell you who can't do it. None of the 4 freshman Congress people that are out constantly tweeting and talking about Israel. Let's focus on problems like healthcare.
So first of all, I think that is an unintentional argument for kings. When you say, could the leader take the 4 smartest merchants in the land, hang a sword over their necks and say, figure out how to get to China or die? Yeah, it's been done before. But in our society, I don't think we're going to successfully do that. To me, the intermediate step here to some large extent would be just cutting out the bullshit. I would favor returning to a more libertarian, individual-based, if this is your thing, faith-based society. I think most people would. But as a first step, you could simply take the cost of these bureaucracies and either give it back to the taxpayer or give it directly to people. That's something feasible, although unlikely. In healthcare, for example, a legitimate compromise position would be getting rid of our 9 healthcare bureaucracies and having some limited form of national healthcare. Or again, returning that money. We're at a position of a maximum illogical inefficiency here. Hopefully that can't exist for all that long. Although I think that you guys are probably right when you say that there's an element of intent to that. The more such bureaucracies you have, the more constituencies you have.
Teachers, that's right. They become, the term is clients. The term is serfs.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You become clients. You become serfs. You become dependent on somebody else feeding you.
Well, and a serf is not a stakeholder, right? Because whenever you have these big organizations talking about stakeholders, it's all the people that make a lot of money. It's never the actual client. They make decisions in spite of your intent and your feedback. Like a friend of mine has ALS, and his main thing is like, you guys all want to make decisions. I'm the guy with ALS. Why don't you ask me about how to care for me when you make these big decisions? Because it's going to change how you see it. And it's rare to have that, to have them go, hey, the stakeholder is, the student who's going to get the loan or whatever. Now, they don't matter. They'll pay it. They'll figure it out. Whatever.
Right.
Let's let you get out of here. So I appreciate it, Will. Thank you very much. We obviously need to do more of these. And Richard, seriously, thank you. That was a fun, lively talk. And when the new book comes out, please come back on and let's discuss it.
Oh, that sounds wonderful, Pete. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Will.